In the stillness of its grand and silent sanctuary, the Shrine of St. Joseph stands as a modern-day witness to faith, perseverance, and commitment. The quiet speaks powerfully to its simple beauty and impressive sense of dignity. What its 19th century architecture and handcrafted wooden statues and icons do not speak to are the people of this church. Those men and women who more than a century and a half ago would begin it, to a group of modern-day heroes who would ultimately save it. In the Archdiocese of St. Louis, the Shrine of St. Joseph is an extraordinary Catholic shrine. Its majestic and stately appearance is almost breathtaking. But even more than that, the Shrine of St. Joseph possesses an historical richness, which is both extraordinary and in every way miraculous. For almost 150 years, this church has been the Church of Miracles. This is the Mass celebrating the Feast of St. Joseph, the day which commemorates and honors the life of Joseph, husband of the Virgin Mary, and foster father of Jesus Christ. More than 1,000 people from all over the St. Louis metropolitan area have come to worship and give thanks to God. Some come because they were married in this church, others because they were baptized here or their relatives attended here, and still others because of the history and tradition of this church, now called the Shrine of St. Joseph. One of the grandest traditions at St. Joseph's is the veneration of a relic from St. Peter Claver. The relic in this case is a bone chip from the body of Peter Claver, a Jesuit priest known for his ministry to slaves being shipped out of Africa and into Colombia, South America. After every Sunday Mass at St. Joseph's, the faithful are invited to venerate or kiss the relic. Venerating a relic like this is a sign of honor and a source of healing. Venerating this relic of St. Peter Claver has been a regular occurrence here since the first days of this church, and the main reason St. Joseph's is known as the Church of Miracles. Les McLaughlin conducts the public tours at the Shrine of St. Joseph. He is the docent for this noble church. In 1843, as waves of German immigrants came to St. Louis to begin their new lives in the United States, Bishop Peter Kenrick saw the need for a church that would serve them exclusively. St. Joseph's would be only the 6th Catholic church in the city.
So Bishop Kenrick went to the Jesuits at St. Louis University and he asked them to build a church for the Germans. He even went so far as to say if you didn't speak German, you didn't read German, you could not fulfill your Sunday obligation here at St. Joseph's. I don't think it'd get any more German than that. Didn't look like it does today, but the Jesuits kept adding on to and extending the church until the way you see the inside today. This is the way it looked in the spring of 1866.
St. Joseph sits majestically at the corners of 11th and Biddle, only a few blocks north of St. Louis's downtown business district. While a few residential areas dot the surrounding neighborhood, St. Joseph's no longer serves the area as a parish church. That distinction goes to St. Patrick's Church about 5 blocks to the east. What most people do not know about this imposing church is that it is the only place in the Archdiocese of St. Louis where a miracle authenticated by the Vatican has taken place. It happened in 1864 when Ignatius Strecker, a German immigrant, was healed from a terminal illness after he venerated the relic of Peter Claver. This miraculous healing would lead to the canonization of Peter Claver as a saint in the Catholic Church. Strecker had been injured while working at a soap factory in downtown St. Louis.
He was struck in the chest with a piece of metal rather violently. He didn't think too much about it at first, but his health began to deteriorate, and finally the doctors diagnosed him as having tuberculosis in its later stages, and which was fatal.
His nephew was Bishop Strecker, who was in Kansas City. He accidentally struck his chest against a pointed piece of iron. His breastbone was injured, and there was no considerable pain, a burning sensation. So the tumor-like inflammation began to grow, and there was no way to drain off accumulated malignant matter.
And they were giving him just a few weeks to live. Just at that time, a Jesuit missionary came in here to give a mission, and after one of his sermons, he said he'd like those who were ill or sick or injured to stay, and he would give them a special blessing with the relic of Blessed Peter Claver. The relic being a bone chip of Peter Claver. Well, the wife of this man who was dying heard this, and she went home and implored her husband to come back over here to get the special blessing with the relic. He agreed to do that, and they carried him over here on a stretcher, and he kissed the relic.
Strecker himself would say later that when his lips touched the crucifix containing the relic, he felt what he called a sudden surge of strength throughout his body. He was able to then walk out of the church, unassisted.
The priest prayed over him and blessed him with the relic and so on, and he walked out of church. So the doctors who had been with him in all this, they knew everything. They just said, this is a miracle because it's unexplainable. It's only God could do that.
And a few days later, he went back to work and lived for another 17 years. That has been authenticated as a true miracle by the Vatican and is one of the two miracles that made Blessed Peter Claver St. Peter Claver.
2 years after the healing of Ignatius Strecker in 1866, another miracle took place here. While it has never been officially authenticated by the Vatican, the incident began to solidify the reputation of St. Joseph's as a church of miracles.
There was a great cholera epidemic going on in the city of St. Louis. There was an average of 270 people a day dying from the cholera. And there were 15 to 25 funeral masses here every day at St. Joseph's. So the Jesuit pastor at that time got the parishioners together, and he said, let's make a vow to St. Joseph that if he intercedes with God to stop the cholera epidemic, we will build something in his memory. Well, from that day forward, no one who made the vow, nor any member of their family died from the cholera. We think that's a miracle.
To honor St. Joseph for his intercession to spare any parishioner from the cholera epidemic, the Jesuits built a new high altar in the sanctuary of the church. Today, it is still called the Altar of Answered Prayers.
Lord, you are holy indeed, the fountain of all holiness.
Father Valentine Young, the administrator of St. Joseph's, believes miracles still take place at St. Joseph's. He remembers vividly the Sunday a distraught mother brought her 3-month-old son to church.
She was crying and saying, the doctor said he has a tumor in his brain and it's inoperable. There's just no hope at all. I said, well, bless him with the relic of St. Peter Claver, and you pray and ask God for a miracle, because God works miracles through the intercession of a saint. It's God who does it. And so we did, and she did, and a year later she came back and she says, Father, here he is. She said, the doctors said that there is no sign of a tumor. He's completely cured. So she said, that's the miracle. I said, well, yeah, that's what God does, because you have faith. Because Jesus, always, whenever the Lord worked a miracle in the gospel, he always said, your faith has cured you. Your faith has made you whole.
How many other miracles have occurred here? No one really knows. But many of the church's supporters today would say the fact that St. Joseph's is still standing today is a miracle in itself. When St. Joseph's was expanded to its present size in the 1860s, it was the largest church in St. Louis. Over the next century, the Jesuit priests continued to staff and operate the parish.
One time they had 5 priests assigned here, and they would fill this. Originally, the church sat 1,200 people. Today it only seats 1,000 because some pews have been removed. But say, and they would fill this 5 times on Sunday. And they even had a chapel that's located beneath the altar that sat about 200 people. And when they would fill this, they would move the people down to the chapel to see the.
While the 1860s saw St. Joseph's as a beacon of light and vitality, it was the 1960s when St. Joseph's finally began to wither and fall apart. Less than a dozen blocks away from St. Joseph's, the St. Louis riverfront was beginning its own renaissance. The Gateway Arch would loom over the city as a monument to westward expansion and stand as a symbol of the city's effort to revitalize its downtown community. But St. Joseph's was not part of that visionary enterprise. The church was now mired in a changing neighborhood. Parishioners were moving out. Small industries were moving in. And St. Joseph's appeared to be doomed, deteriorating bit by bit, both inside and out. Ralph Ellerbrock is the organist at St. Joseph's. He grew up in the neighborhood, which back then was still a bastion for the German community. He began playing the church organ here when he was 12.
In the original choir, when I started, all our Christmas carols were in German. We sang German Christmas carols because you had to be German when this church was first started. And it was still the era now.
He also remembers how the neighborhood began to decline. The tenement housing units were replaced with truck terminals as the city tried to turn a dying area into a business center for the trucking industry. As the neighborhoods disintegrated, so did the church.
The tenement houses were all being torn down, and the truck lines were taking over around here. And the people just, they just lost interest in it. And even though the Jesuits were still here at that time, we had maybe about 50 people in church, and then it'd start dwindling down. And then towards the end, when the Jesuits were here, there were maybe only 2 or 3 people in church, and there were maybe 2 of us up on a choir.
It was a standing joke at the time that there were more pigeons nesting in the church than there were parishioners. Pigeon droppings were everywhere. Those around then knew that it was simply a matter of time before St. Joseph's would be abandoned and probably torn down by the archdiocese.
The bricks in the walls were showing. There were birds flying around. It was in bad shape. And actually the Pfeffer organ did not work at that time because it was so full of pigeon dirt. Oh, there were times when it was really run down that I thought that it was finished.
But in the late 70s, a group of 5 men would begin an effort that would ultimately save the church. There was Ted Wolford, an architect, Gene Boll, a woodworker, Charlie Finninger, the owner of a catering firm, Bob Voss, a St. Louis businessman, and Bob Ortega, a St. Louis photographer. Until they became involved with St. Joseph's, they had never met. They would form a friendship and an alliance that defied the odds.
I don't know how the 5 of us were appointed, but some force back there from St. Joseph or Jesus Christ had these 5 men put together, and we got it started.
They were the instruments, what some would call the heroes, who would begin a 20-year effort that would restore St. Joseph's to its original state. They would become the first members of a group they named the Shrine of St. Joseph's Friends. To a man, they could somehow see the church's inherent beauty, what it was at one time, and what it could be again. They had the vision to see beneath the debris and understand the true majesty and craftsmanship of the building. They had the vision to see what others could not.
I mean, there was a grandeur even in disrepair. It was still a very, very impressive
place. I mean, you could see underneath the dirt and behind, and looking past broken plaster and sagging windows and things. There was something about it.
It was my faith in this place. I thought it was a magnificent church when it was crumbling down. And the church proper was. The walls were in bad shape, the ceilings. But it was something about the Shrine of St. Joseph that gets in your blood.
What I saw in this interior was an interior that said something back to me. That the proportions were elegant, were beautiful. The glass was unique, I thought. There were many beautiful details of carving and things. Somehow or other, as I said, it showed care and love and the things that a church should show.
I walked in, I saw it was like a color picture went off in my head. I just fell in love with the place. And being a woodworker too, all my life, I walked in and saw it like this. It looked just like it looked. I had that picture. It was like a color picture in my head. I walked in and I saw a finished product.
The architecture was, the unique thing about it was it held together even in spite of every effort to tear it apart. I mean, the altars were spray painted with Zolatone, the worst paint in the world to try to get off. The color that was on them was carnival blues and pinks and stuff. I mean, if you began to analyze any piece, it was a disaster. But somehow or other, when it all got together, you didn't care. There was a sense of peace and an order to this building that was uncanny. The colors were terrible. It had a linoleum floor, battleship linoleum floor that clunked like mad. I mean, you know, it was kind of a yellow. The statues were broken, literally had dried out and cracked apart.
The statues throughout the church today are magnificent. All of them are carved out of wood. St. Peter Claver. St. Therese of Lisieux. The Guardian Angel. The Pietà. One of the most dramatic is the statue of St. Joseph as he was dying. At his side, Jesus and Mary. But when the Friends of St. Joseph began their work, this statue, and many of the others, were in utter disrepair. A chasm-like crack had all but destroyed the dying Joseph. Mill workers would eventually pull the dried-out parts back together and restore it to its original splendor. There was one other man who would play perhaps the most pivotal role in the restoration of St. Joseph's. The 77-year-old pastor of the church, Father Edward Filipiak. It was Father Filipiak who had first pulled together this small posse of visionaries and implored them to take on the task of saving this historic church.
And I came down the first morning and met the priest, who was very old, snaggle-toothed. I mean, you know, certainly nothing great in appearance. Had a great smile. This Father Filipiak. And I thought, my first reaction when I saw that number one, he was living in the worst poverty I'd seen. I had done the survey of LaSalle Park and had stepped on vagrants and everything else, but I had never seen anybody living in the conditions that he was living in. And the rectory had most of the plaster off the walls. The electrical system was a very spooky cord hanging from the ceiling that had probably hung there for 100 years with a light bulb on the end of it. He was so frail that he couldn't get in and out of the safe, so he had church records all over the floor where he could access them. He lived in one room on the best that could be said for it is high army furniture.
I don't know anybody else who would live in the conditions that that man. I'd visit with him. He had 2.5-inch roaches crawling up the wall, and it wasn't habitable for animals, much less a human, much less a priest.
And I thought, what am I getting into? We walked through the door into the church, and the man totally changed. I mean, he just radiated, and he said, "Isn't it beautiful?" And I realized then that the reason he lived that way was that every penny that he had and every penny that came into this church, he put into keeping the church standing. He was bent and determined that this church would survive. And from that moment on, I was committed. I mean, there was no turning back. It had to be done.
At the time, Father Filipiak was one of the oldest priests in the archdiocese. While his role at St. Joseph's was to pastor the small number of parishioners, he also became a watchdog of sorts, a gatekeeper who knew that if he ever moved out, there would be virtually no hope of saving the church.
We didn't try to talk him out of staying here because, that would be like trying to talk to Mount Rushmore to, become a gravel pit. He was committed. He never wavered and he never allowed us to even do the slightest improvement in the house.
He totally refused to move. And he told me many times, I used to stop and visit with him, he said, "The day I move out, the next morning the headache bill will be in here." And he says, "I ain't moving." That's his words. "I ain't moving," he said.
What was wonderful about him was that he was in this, what I guess most priests would view as the parish from hell, and it didn't bother him at all.
Saving St. Joseph's and restoring it would be a nearly impossible task. It would take literally years of work by a group of volunteers trying desperately to salvage a hulk of a building no one seemed to have any use for. The first needs were obvious: a new roof and the money to put it on.
So I called up Bob Ortega on January 8th, and I said, "I got an idea, Bob." I says, "Father Filipiak can't raise money, but you and I aren't priests." I says, "Why don't we start a not-for-profit corporation, set up a fund in a bank where people send." The roof was leaking terribly. It was, then nobody would fix it because I think they, quite frankly, wanted the place to get so bad it had to be torn down. And they said, "We'll raise money for a roof, and if we can't pull this thing off, the bank will hold the money, and if we can't pull it off, the people get their money back, so they have nothing to lose. And if we do put the roof on, everybody's gained."
Meantime, rumors continued to run rampant that the archdiocese wanted to abandon the parish, sell the land, and build another church a few blocks east, closer to the new convention center. About the same time, it was discovered that originally the land here at 11th and Biddle had belonged to the Biddle family, and had been donated to the archdiocese specifically for the purpose of building St. Joseph's Church. The agreement with the archdiocese stipulated that the land could never be sold for a non-religious purpose. Otherwise, the property would revert back to the Biddle estate. That meant the archdiocese could not sell the land and reap any financial benefits. The Friends of St. Joseph now had some new life and new hope. They would eventually lease the church from the archdiocese for 5 years at a cost of $1 a year. It was an effort to see if this small group of men could do the impossible: raise the money needed to restore a church nobody wanted. The initial efforts to raise the money were stymied. No one wanted to donate or invest any money in a depressed neighborhood for a church that had more pigeons than parishioners. Father Filipiak continued to stay in the old rectory and kept insisting that no money be spent on him.
He says, Gene, don't spend a penny on me. He says, put it in the church. He says, I'd die for this church. He refused to move. He says, I'd die for that church, and he did.
St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, the 8th chapter, the 28th verse, says that we know that God makes all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his decree. In perhaps the darkest hour in the history of St. Joseph's, God would make all things work together for those who were trying so valiantly to rebuild an historic church. An act of violence would rally an entire city around this seemingly hopeless cause to save St. Joseph's. During the evening of September 29, 1979, 3 teenage boys entered the rundown rectory, made their way upstairs to the second-floor room of Father Filipiak, and brutally murdered him.
In fact, he would stick up for anybody. That's why when he was murdered, it was just a waste of a life, because he would have gave those 3 boys that did it, he would have given them whatever he had. They didn't have to do it because he used to sit out on the steps, and when kids would go by, he'd give them whatever he had in his pocket. That's just the type of person he was. And they caught the 3 fellas that murdered him, and one was killed in prison, one committed suicide in prison, and one still is in prison. I was floored. I mean, I really was. It just shocked me. In fact, that was one of the hardest funerals I ever played.
I was at home because they called as soon as they had found the body. But and it was a terrible shock. But what it did was it galvanized the community. I mean, I think without his death, we probably wouldn't have done it either.
Father, of course, would never believe what had happened after his death, but certainly it was his death that really began everything here. There were people prior to his death trying to do things, but they couldn't seem to get the money to do them. And so, you know, that death really inspired people, to say the least.
None of this would be here if it hadn't been for him.
A true priest. Loved this church more than anyone else could have loved. It meant everything. Meant everything to him. He just had all the faith in the world that we weren't going to fail. I think that even made me continue on. And then, of course, when he was murdered, we had to go on. There was something, a driving force behind us that we had to go on in his honor.
Father Filipiak's brutal murder was an energizing force in the months and years that would follow. It created enough attention about St. Joseph's that most people now knew about the restoration efforts. New volunteers were eager to help. Ted Schaefer's, a business writer for the Old Globe Democrat, became one of the early fundraisers for the shrine.
I've been a reporter and writer for many years, and I knew a lot of the business members of the community. I knew the leaders in labor. I covered labor for 10 years. So I go to all these people that I know and told them that I was now active in trying to raise money for the Shrine to St. Joseph, and I expected them to donate. And I told them, I said, I don't want you to get angry at me. I don't like to ask for money. But I'm not begging for myself, I'm begging for St. Joseph, and it worked. We got some substantial money. It's the only money that really came in. There were days when, there were weeks when you were wondering how we're going to do something. You never knew where the money was coming from, but it seemed like, it almost got me believing, believe me. Because it just seemed like every time we were at the wit's end of knowing where we were going to go next, something would happen. Something good would happen. Somebody would come up and leave some money or give you some money. I told you the story about how I went trying to get a little increase on a $2,500 donation from a bank. And much to my surprise, he handed me a check for $25,000. The biggest amount that I've ever got involved in was a man who was of Jewish faith. And he pledged $100,000 in $25,000 increments. He lived in those tenements and became a millionaire. And he thought he owed something to the neighborhood. Not to the church so much, but to the neighborhood.
The church had been neglected for so long that the endeavor to restore it was unusually demanding and complicated. It would require a Herculean effort.
It was very tough. The first few years, there was many a time I didn't, my nerves were a little rattled on it. St. Joseph kept me going. I really think that. Because when everybody was down on us, I always prayed to St. Joe's to help us. And again, he did more than help us.
You can't turn back on something like this. I mean, it was a commitment that I think everybody has made in a sense of a very serious commitment, not a vow, but the kind of thing that you just don't walk away from. And there were times when just survival was an enormous chore, and a lot of it came out of people's pockets just to keep the thing going.
The carpet was laid for free. A lot of painting was done for free. A lot of carpenter work was done for free. And when you start getting that kind of support, you begin to think you have a chance.
We didn't even have a lot of followers in the beginning. Told us, do a good job, but we didn't see a lot of money in the beginning. But somehow or other down the way, from fundraisers to wills to money, it just keeps growing.
The unique thing about the restoration has been that it has been so controlled. We've only done what we could do with the money, and we've been able to control each step of it. The same painters have worked from beginning to end. They, like all of us, have gotten a heck of a lot older in the process, and now their kids are involved.
Restoring a church like St. Joseph's is not a matter of refinishing or repainting or remodeling. Restoration means restoring it exactly the way it was first constructed, with exactly the same colors. But in 1866, there were very few black and white pictures, much less color photos. So Ted Wolford and his workers had to scrape and chip away more than a century's worth of paint to discover the original colors.
And when we finally were able to establish the original finishes, particularly the surround of the windows, which always seemed small when we began to move with it, the windows didn't seem properly expressed in the space. And so we knew there was something happening around them, but what it was very hard to get to, because the original decoration was a cassine paint that is very fragile, and it was under layers and layers and layers of other paints that were like armor. And so it took many, many, many tries to get the process of removing the paint to stop at the right place in order to document the moldings that ultimately went around the windows. And the thing that's been so wonderful about this room is that every time we went through this process and we came to what was really supposed to be there, it fit.
The windows themselves were a major priority. Repairing and sealing them would preserve the inside of the church from any more weather-related damage.
The windows were sagging. They were literally falling out. When we started to restore them, they had to be cleaned. You can imagine the dirt. And they had to be cleaned with a toothbrush, each piece. They were re-leaded. They were brought back, and resecured to bars properly. But miraculously, we were able to match the glass.
First the roof and some tuck pointing on the outside walls, and then the windows. After that, the pigeon issue. What to do with what turned out to be 50 tons of pigeon droppings inside the church's 2 bell towers.
When we started the restoration back in 1980, the bells didn't ring because there was so much bird dropping up in the tower. So we had to find somebody to clean that out, and I didn't volunteer. But we found a company, and they sent a couple of men up there like in spacesuits because it's so toxic. And they start digging that out of there. And what they dug out of there was 100,000 pounds of bird dropping.
The work to restore the Shrine of St. Joseph has taken more than 2 decades, and there is still work to be done. But none of this would have happened without the hundreds of volunteers who over the years gave their time, their energy, and in some cases their money to complete the work. To date, more than $3 million has been raised and spent to finish the project. The shrine once again has become the focal point of the area. New housing complexes have been built. The neighborhood has been stabilized. The restoration project is still in progress at the Shrine of St. Joseph. One of the latest efforts centers on the church's giant Pfeffer organ, manufactured and first installed in 1890 by the Joseph Pfeffer Pipe Organ Company of St. Louis.
It's on the historical landmark in addition to the church, so we can't add anything to it. Like if we want to put chimes or something to it, we can't. We could put them alongside it, but the organ has to be exactly what it was 110 years ago. And you can't add anything and you can't take anything away.
It was 1980 by the time there was enough money to restore the organ the first time. It had deteriorated over time and did not play at all. Back then, members of the St. Louis Organ Society took it apart and repaired it. Restoring the organ this time, the Martin Ott Organ Company in St. Louis County.
And that first day that they came down here, I sat up there and watched them take apart. I couldn't sleep that night. They took my baby apart. No, it was interesting. What they did is they took a piece off at a time and took a picture of the piece there, then took a picture of the piece sitting by itself, so that they know exactly where every piece of that organ goes that they took off. And they took it all to their plant.
Where they are restoring everything, from new ivory on the keyboard to a new leather bellow.
I will walk before the Lord.
The Shrine of St. Joseph, the Church of Miracles. Do miracles still happen here? Frank Fessler and his wife Julianne think so.
It's in the summer of 1985. We were big ballpark fans, and we knew there was 11 o'clock Mass here. And we decided to attend Mass before a ball game. And we immediately fell in love with the shrine. and decided this was the place we were to be wed at.
The Fesslers were married at the shrine. Their son Frankie and daughter Tess were both baptized here. And they believe their prayers were answered here too, when their son was born with a serious heart problem.
My son was born with basically a half of a heart, and he had his first surgery. He was born with hypoplastic right heart and pulmonary atresia, and he had his first surgery when he was under 24 hours of age. And he subsequently had another surgery when he was 9 days old, and then 3 months old, 6 months old, and then 3 years old. So he's had a succession of surgeries to correct his heart problem. And we'll probably be facing another one down the road. We just don't know when. And my daughter Tess had one surgery at birth, and she is doing fine. They were in St. Louis Children's Hospital, and one of us came down here almost every day. And this is truly the altar of answered prayers for us, which it is, at the Shrine of St. Joseph's. It has helped us through our trying times tremendously, with our faith and the friendship and support that is here. That's why they're here today.
The Shrine of St. Joseph stands today as an icon in a neighborhood which is now making a comeback. New housing is stabilizing this near north side of St. Louis. Property values are increasing. People are coming from all over the region to attend Sunday Mass at the shrine.
This is my body, which will be given up for you.
In many ways, the Shrine of St. Joseph symbolizes everything good about the human spirit. For it to be still standing in this 21st century, many would say is a miracle in itself. For it took an extraordinary effort from a group of ordinary men. Men with last names of Artega, Boll, Finninger, Voss, Wolford, and Filipiak. Men whose commitment and perseverance, whose courage and vision, preserve the century-old roots and German heritage of the first families in this parish. People like the Lautenbachers, the Ubens, the Brauns, the Kohlstedts, and the Landzettels. And today they still come here to this glorious church. So many people of God with so many needs, coming before the altar of answered prayers, venerating the relic of St. Peter Claver, asking for a favor, a healing, a miracle.
Another major difference here in the church is the pulpit behind me. This pulpit was manufactured here in South St. Louis and installed here in the church in 1894. It's all hand carven out of wood. You see little figures that go around the side of the pulpit. Those are 4 of the doctors of the church. Around to St. Jerome, St. Leo, and on the far side over here is St. Ambrose. The side altar is called the Jesuit altar. And the reason it's called the Jesuit altar is that all the statues up there are of Jesuits who have become saints. The Jesuit altar is just a memorial to the Jesuits. There are 3 statues of Jesuits who were martyred or who died at a very young age. One is St. Aloysius Gonzaga, who's the patron of youth. The other 2 are St. Stanislaus Kostka and St. John Berchams. And below the Jesuit altar, there's a statue of Jesus Christ in the Holy Sepulchre. I don't know if you can see that statue of the Blessed Mother encased behind glass up there, but there's a story behind that. When the Jesuits extended this church out in 1866, they ordered a new statue of the Blessed Mother from Europe. But before the one they had ordered was completed, this one was finished, and scheduled to go into the cathedral in Paris, France, into Notre Dame Cathedral. But there was a little war going on between the French and the Prussians, the Franco-Prussian War, and the manufacturer couldn't deliver it to Notre Dame, so they sent it over here to the Jesuits. It's a much more beautiful, much more expensive statue of the Blessed Mother than what they had originally ordered, and so they encased it behind glass. And as far as I can determine, that glass has never been removed. Above the statue of our Blessed Mother, there's a Latin inscription that says, Ecce Matre Tua, which means, behold your mother. And in the silver shield above that, it says, Hail Mary, full of grace. And then there are other statues, of course, on the Blessed Mother's altar. There's St. Agnes. And St. Cecilia. And below the altar, there's a mannequin of St. Justin the Boy Martyr. St. Justin the Boy Martyr was a teenager who lived in France in the 3rd century, and when they were persecuting Catholics. And one day after he had taken communion, they grabbed him and they slit his throat to try to remove the host out of his throat. And that's how he was martyred. Now I like to go over the details of the altar with you. If you look at the very top in the center, you see the Sacred Heart. And then on either side of the Sacred Heart, you see angels. The angel over here on my right is holding the cross of salvation. And the angel on the other side is holding the anchor of hope. And if you come down below the Sacred Heart, you see a Latin inscription that says Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam, which means for the greater glory of God, and which is the motto of the Jesuits. I told you the Jesuits began this parish back in 1843, and they didn't leave here until 1966. That means, of course, they were here for 123 years, and they definitely left their stamp on the altar and on the church. Below that Latin inscription, you see the shield of the Holy Name. And then below that shield of the Holy Name is another Latin inscription that says, Ita ad Joseph, which means go to Joseph for your needs. And then below that is the statue of St. Joseph and the Christ Child. And below that is the tabernacle. And on top of the tabernacle, you see the golden crown for Christ the King. And below the tabernacle and through the legs of the altar table, you see the sacrificial lamb on the tomb of a martyr, representing the Lamb of God. If you go back up to the top of the altar, you see 4 statues going across the top of the altar. Those are the 4 evangelists. The one over here on my left is St. John, and then St. Luke, St. Mark, and St. Matthew. Below those 4 statues are statues on either side of St. Joseph and the Christ Child. Over here on my right is St. Ignatius of Loyola, who was the founder of the Jesuits. And on the other side is St. Francis Xavier, another early Jesuit. If you go back up to the top above St. Francis Xavier and between the statues of St. John and St. Luke, you see some gold lettering on the blue background that says ex voto, which is Latin for from a vow, or in fulfillment of a vow, the vow that the parishioners had made to stop the cholera epidemic. And then below that in Roman numerals, you see the year 1866, which was the year that the altar was actually made, although not installed here until 1867. On the other side, between the statues of St. Mark and St. Matthew, there's some more gold lettering on the blue background that says in Latin, altar, and below that, privileged. This is a privileged altar, a privilege granted by the Vatican for whomever a requiem mass is said that person will receive planetary indulgences. If you go above the high altar into the ceiling of the sanctuary, you see the paintings. In the center is our Blessed Mother in the Assumption mode. And on my left over here, on her right, is her parents, St. Anne and St. Joachim. And on the other side of her is Abraham, where we came from, and King David, because St. Joseph was from the house of David. The two kneeling angels sitting on the floor alongside of the altar in the pink robes were installed here in 1894, the same year that this pulpit was installed here and manufactured by the same company here in South St. Louis, a good Irish company called Schneiderhan. Now, you know, for many decades, this church was lit by gaslight, and all the carbon from that gas went up there and stuck on the ceiling. So they had to clean that off before they could repaint it. It took them 2 years and $200,000 to clean it and to repaint it. After that was completed, they came down and they redid the pulpit. The Jesuits had painted the pulpit in off-white. So we had it restored to its natural color at a cost of $5,600. After that was completed, then we redid these columns here. These are hollow wooden columns. They're just walnut steam bent to make them circular. They put linen on the outside, and then they paint it to look like they are marble. But in fact, they're hollow wooden columns. The next project we had was to restore these pews. These are the original pews from the 1860s. Now, people ask me, why are they divided? Why do they have a division here? Well, the Jesuits used to rent out the pews. If you wanted pew 20 for the 9 o'clock Mass, you paid the Jesuits a dime. So they could then rent this side and they could rent that side and make 20 cents. People also ask me, why are they up on a platform? Well, back in the 1860s when they were installed here, heating wasn't too good and it was warmer for people to sit up on a platform. So when you get out of the pew, please step down. And thank you for visiting the Shrine of St. Joseph.